Every basic economics textbook tells the same story about where money comes from. It claims that long before banks or coins, humans relied on a primitive barter system to trade the things they needed to survive. But this story is a complete myth. The fable was popularized by Adam Smith. He imagined a world where you traded a cow for a pair of shoes, or grain for lumber, until the sheer complexity of matching every neighbor's specific needs forced us to invent coins. But anthropologists have spent decades looking for this primordial barter society, and they have never found a single example. In reality, direct trade was usually a tense ritual between strangers or enemies, not the daily life of a village. If the textbook story of mutual exchange is a fiction, we have to look deeper for the origin of money. It wasn't built on a handshake, it was built on a ledger of debt. 5,000 years ago, in the early villages of Mesopotamia, survival didn't depend on on-the-spot trading. It depended on human credit. If you needed grain to feed your family, your neighbor gave it to you, and you owed them in return. As these villages grew into massive city-states, the informal memory of a neighborhood couldn't scale. The early temples and palaces faced a massive logistical crisis. They had to track barley rations for thousands of workers and enforce the collection of grain yields. Administrators created geometric clay tokens, like a cone for grain, to track state obligations. As the system scaled, these tokens were pressed into wet clay. By adding phonetic signs for names, accountants invented the first written script, not for poetry, but to perpetually record debt. Money wasn't created to help strangers buy and sell goods. It was a tool of administration, a rigid system of account designed to track exactly what every citizen owed to the state. Over time, these abstract ledgers of debt evolved into physical items that could be traded. These objects became the hardware for a consensus network that eventually spanned the globe. For hundreds of years, cowrie shells functioned as one of the most successful early currencies. They were durable, portable, and easily counted, making them the perfect physical record for trade across Africa and Asia. On the island of Yap, the ledger reached a massive scale. Islanders used giant limestone discs called ryestones to conduct business. Because they were too heavy to move, ownership was transferred through a public oral record, essentially a shared ledger of who owned which stone. Whether a tiny shell or a multi-ton rock, these items had no value on their own. Their power came entirely from the community's shared trust in the ledger they represented. This trust was put to the test in ancient Lydia, where the primary currency was electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver. The problem was that the ratio of gold in any given nugget was inconsistent, meaning no one could be sure of its true value at a glance. This created massive friction in the market. Every transaction required the metal to be weighed and tested on a touchstone, a slow process that limited the speed of trade and invited fraud. King Croesus solved this by melting the metal down into pure gold and silver and striking it with a royal seal. This stamp served as a state-backed guarantee of weight and purity, allowing coins to be exchanged instantly by sight. By placing the royal seal on every unit of metal, the Lydian state transitioned from measuring a natural resource to dictating its official value. Wealth in the kingdom now required the crown's endorsement to exist, positioning the state as the sole arbiter of value. Once a central authority controls the definition of value, they gain an irresistible ability. They can change the rules of the ledger whenever they are in trouble. In the early days of the Roman Empire, the denarius was the gold standard of trust. Under Emperor Augustus, it was minted from nearly pure silver, symbolizing the strength and stability of the imperial state. But as Rome's military expansion created massive debts, later emperors grew desperate. They began melting down the pure coins, mixing them with cheap copper, and re-stamping them with the same face value to pay their soldiers. This is the core mechanism of debasement. By lowering the silver content, the treasury could issue more currency without mining more metal, effectively creating new money while the actual cost was silently absorbed by the public through a loss of purchasing power. The results were catastrophic. Over 2 centuries, the silver purity in Roman coinage plummeted from nearly 100% to less than 5%. The physical money supply reflected this collapse, replaced by a flood of dark, corroded copper. Trust in the state ledger was completely shattered. Following Gresham's law, citizens hoarded the old pure coins and dumped the debased copper ones back into the economy as quickly as possible. Prices exploded. Merchants began demanding hundreds of the worthless copper coins for simple goods like grain or oil, sparking a hyperinflationary spiral that the empire could not control. The Roman experience demonstrated that a centralized ledger is only as stable as the authority that manages it. This pattern of dilution for short-term spending became a template for centuries of future governments facing their own bankruptcy. The Romans destroyed their economy by watering down physical metal. It leaves us with one haunting question. What happens to this cycle of manipulation when the money isn't made of metal at all, but relies entirely on paper and a promise? To understand the modern struggle for financial control, you have to look at what happens when money gets too heavy. In 11th century China, commerce had a physical speed limit. Hauling strings of chained copper coins between towns was exhausting work. The weight of the metal was friction that slowed the entire economy. To solve this, merchants began leaving their copper piles with trusted shops in exchange for paper receipts. It was a practical shortcut, but it required a psychological shift. They were now trusting a human promise instead of the physical weight of metal. When the Mongols conquered China, Kublai Khan institutionalized this shift. He made paper money the only legal currency, backed by nothing but his own command. Trust was no longer a choice between merchants. It was mandated by the state. This map shows how that decree spread. As the Mongol Empire expanded, local metal coins were erased from the economy. The central authority pushed out uniform paper notes, forcing millions to rely on a currency with no physical anchor. Marco Polo wrote that the Khan had mastered the secret of alchemy, turning plain paper into the wealth of a kingdom. But the secret had a limit. While a coin must be physically mined and minted, paper is simply printed. The emperors printed until the money lost its value, forcing the later Ming dynasty to abandon paper entirely and return to metal. The Mongol experiment revealed a pattern. When money is unchained from physical constraints, the ability to print without limit eventually destroys the trust that makes the paper valuable. In Renaissance Florence, the Medici family found a way to bypass the physical and the spiritual. The church strictly banned charging interest on loans, labeling it the sin of usury. To grow their wealth, the Medici needed to disguise the profit. They used a tool called the bill of exchange. A merchant deposited money in Florence and collected it months later in another city, like London, in a different currency. The bank's profit was hidden inside the exchange rate. It was a loan with the interest rebranded as a service fee. This map illustrates the result. A deposit made in Florence is securely transmitted and unlocked in London. This network allowed the Medici to move value across borders without moving heavy chests of gold, funding popes and kings through an invisible ledger. This shifted the nature of money. It was no longer just a pile of metal in a vault. It had become an abstract network of communication managed by a banking institution. By the late 1800s, the world's major economies tried to standardize this trust by adopting the gold standard. Every paper note was a contract. Carry it to a bank and you could swap it for a fixed amount of real gold. This placed a physical limit on how much money any government could print. But that limit became a liability during the First World War. Governments needed to spend far beyond their gold reserves to fund the conflict. One by one, they quietly suspended the rules, printing the currency they needed to stay in the fight. This chart tracks the impact. You see decades of stable, flat lines under the gold standard. But as the war begins and the anchor is cut, the line spikes into the volatile peaks of rapid inflation. In post-war Germany, this reached an extreme. Forced to pay debts it didn't have the gold for, the government printed marks around the clock. By 1923, prices doubled every few days. People burned banknotes for heat because the paper was worth less than firewood. An entire nation's savings were wiped out in months. The collapse proved that a physical anchor is only as strong as the government's willingness to respect it. When the choice is between financial stability and survival in a crisis, the anchor is always the first thing to be cut. After the Second World War, the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement created a new global anchor, the US dollar. Every other currency was tied to the dollar, and the dollar was tied to gold. The system relied on the promise that the United States would always keep enough gold to honor every dollar in circulation. By the late 1960s, that promise was failing. Between the Vietnam War and massive domestic spending, the U.S. was sending more dollars into the global economy than it had gold to back. When other countries, led by France, began demanding gold in exchange for their dollars, the American vaults were quickly depleted. To stop the drain, President Richard Nixon went on television in August 1971. He announced that the dollar could no longer be exchanged for gold. This graphic represents that moment. The final link between the world's reserve currency and a physical commodity was severed. The dollar became pure fiat money, value created by decree. Unlike the regional experiments of the past, this was a global shift. For the first time, the entire international financial system was backed by nothing but trust in the governments that issued the currency. That trust was tested in 2008. Banks had spent years betting on risky home loans, creating a complex web of debt that eventually collapsed. When the system imploded, institutions that had existed for over a century, like Lehman Brothers, vanished in days. The response was to create trillions of new digital dollars to rescue the banks responsible for the crash. While the public lost homes and jobs, the institutions were shielded by money conjured on a screen. This disparity raised a question. If the people in charge of the money can simply create more of it to fix their own mistakes, what is that money actually worth to the people who have to earn it? While the 2008 crisis was still unfolding, an anonymous figure named Satoshi Nakamoto published a document describing a different path. It proposed a form of digital money called Bitcoin. This system was designed to be trustless. Instead of relying on a central bank or a government to manage the ledger, the records are kept by thousands of independent computers simultaneously. No single authority has the power to edit the history or freeze a transaction. Most importantly, Bitcoin introduced a hard mathematical limit. This graphic shows the supply cap. There will only ever be 21 million units. Once that limit is reached, the code prevents any further issuance. This architecture attempts to solve the problem of debasement by moving the rules from a committee of people to an unchangeable set of mathematics. It is the first digital currency to possess a scarcity that cannot be altered by a central decree. In response to the rise of independent digital assets, governments are developing central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. Unlike the physical cash in your wallet, which allows for private transactions, a CBDC is a direct digital link to the central bank. This money is programmable. The state can track every transaction to the cent. Because the money is code-based, it could be set with expiration dates to force spending, or programmed to automatically block certain types of purchases the government deems unapproved. We are moving toward a choice between two versions of digital money. On the left, a decentralized network with no owner and a limit on supply. On the right, a centralized pyramid that allows the state to monitor and restrict how you use your wealth. One system is governed by a hard mathematical limit. The other is governed by the state's ability to track and program your spending. As the physical dollar fades, the question is no longer whether money will be digital, but who will hold the keys to that code? And more importantly, will it be you?